Hello, I'm Li Hao. So we have learned about how we can use elements by passing in attributes as well as how to add event listeners to your elements. And in our last video, we learned about components. We learned about components can be used almost as the same way as elements, and you can pass in props almost as the same way as you can pass in attributes to the elements. So, can an component attach any event listeners? Well, we'll take a look in this video. So over here, I've prepared an example. I've created a component called profile, and I pass in props, just like how we pass in attributes. I pass in props. I have a name called Li Hao, which is me, and then I have a status, which is status that I'm currently learning Svelte. Okay, so in my component, I declared two props, name and status. That's how I pass that in. And I also have this button called skill points. It's a local state skill point, and I have buttons that I can increment or decrement my skill point. So if I click, you can see my skill point is increasing or decreasing. I'm not quite sure what to do with the skill points yet, but that is how this component works. So if I want to know when my skill point has changed, what should I do? If I want to know my skill point, whether when my skill point has changed from this parent component, from the app.svelte, what should I do? Well, one way is I can, firstly, of course I need a callback function so that I can do something when that change. So I can define on skill point change, and hopefully this is some sort of event, right? Maybe like skill point, the new skill point. And what I want to do over here is just to console it out so that you can see that it's being called. So I'm gonna say on skill point change, and then my new skill point. So how do I pass this function into my component? Well, you can pass anything through the attribute, through the props. So it could be string, it could be numbers, and it could be functions as well. No one says that you can't pass in a function as a props. So I can come over here and say maybe on skill point change and pass in my props. And because the props name and the variable name is the same, I can actually use this prop shorthand or the attribute shorthand. So of course I need to define these props or else I can't receive it. So I'm going to define this on skill point change, and I need to use it as well. I need to come over here and call this with the updated skill point value. So I'm going to come here and say skill point, and I need to do it for my skill point over here as well. Okay, looks good. So let's come over here and take a look at the console. So if I change something, you can see that this function is being called, right? That's good. Because if you take a look at this, you say, okay, this has to be called every time skill point is changed. We can use a reactive statements, right? No one says you can't do that. So I can come over here and say on skill point change skill point. So this statement, let's take a look. When will this be called? Whenever on skill point has changed or whenever skill point has changed. That's exactly what we want. So we can come over here, click. You can see that this is being logged out whenever any of it has changed. Okay, so far so good. Yep. But what if I come over here? Okay, I'm not sure whether you like the buts, but but is how I segue into what I want to share next. So if I come over here, I have another profile called me again, and learning component events. Okay, but this time around for this profile, I don't want to know about when the skill point change. Right? I can know and I can just don't care about it. Right? Not all the events I want, not everything I want to know, right? So for this case, I don't want to know. But then because we kind of assumed that on skill point change is a function, because we call it no matter what, then that is a problem to us, and we kind of have to. So the way to work around this is we have to check if type of is a function, then we call this, right? So there's two ways. I jumped the gun too fast, but actually there's two ways to work around this, right? First is every time when you want to call this on skill point change, you check whether it's a function. If it's a function, then you call it. Another way that if you assume that it's either always a function or it's just that not being passed in, then you can have a default function over here, default value for on skill point change, right? So if it's not passed in, then it's always this fallback function, and if it's defined, then yeah, you can call. So if you know that it's either passed in and always be a function or not passed in, then you can do it this way. So two ways that you can do, right? Every time when you call, you check if it's a function. Or secondly, it's you provide default fallback function so that if it's not provided, you can still call it. It's fallback to a function so that you can always trust that it's always a function. Yeah, so nothing wrong about this, but as you can see, we kind of coupled strongly about assumptions of skill point change has to be a function, right? Or else we have to provide a fallback function. But if you take a look at buttons and all the DOM elements you have, usually it's very common that the events itself is optional, right? It's not all buttons you have to listen to on click, on, or not all inputs you have to listen to on input, on change, on anything, right? So it's very common that you listen to events when only you are interested in. So that should be the same case as events from components, right? It shouldn't be like this where you have to always assume that within a function, component itself, always assume that it's always there and you can always call it as a function. You should. It's more of the other case where you should assume that any events that you're going to come out, it should be optional to be received on the other end. So I would kind of prefer you check whether this is being defined and only then you call it. Of course, there's an even better way to do it, which is to use a component event. So let's take a look at how you can dispatch a component event. So before we dive into how, we can take a look at how it should be written instead from the outside, right? Instead of passing in as a function, right, it should be more like an event listener. So instead, we can listen to events. So I'm going to come on event and pass in the name of the event. So I can come up with any name, but now I'm going to call it as skill point change as the name of the event, and I can pass in this function instead, right? This is to handle when this event has been dispatched. Right, so over here, I'm not going to listen to, so I'm not passing it in, and here I can. So it's an optional thing, right? Whenever you do this, you know that it's kind of optional. It's like event listeners for your elements. So how do I make my component to be able to dispatch this event? Well, I can come over here, and I need something called event dispatcher. So I'm going to come here, and I'm import create event dispatcher. Oops. And this is a function that creates the event dispatcher. So let me call this function. So this function itself, the create event dispatcher, has to be called during a component initialization, meaning it has to be called at the top level when we so all these are going to be called during the component initialization, right? So you have to call it at the top level. You can't create event dispatcher within a function, right? That does not work. If you try to call it here and you try to decrement, you will see that you will throw an error. It says that function called outside component initialization. Well, why is this so? Well, this is because when during component initialization, Svelte knows that, okay, I want to initialize this component, this instance of this component. So it's remember, okay, this is the component I'm setting up, and then whenever I call this function, so this function itself, you import directly from Svelte, right? So this function itself has itself kind of like stateless, but at the same time, it's when you call this, it will read. You ask Svelte, hey, what is the component that you are currently initializing, right? When because this function is not coming from anywhere within this component, right? It's not some function that pass it in. So this function within this function itself has to ask Svelte, okay, what is the component you are initializing, and then okay, this function, okay, I'm gonna register, I'm gonna get something from this component, right? So you get the dispatch function, you get what is the component was initializing at that point of time. So you get this dispatch function, and then you can dispatch events. So dispatch events is like how you would dispatch an event on your elements, right? Element can dispatch an event so that anyone from outside can listen to it. So I get this dispatch function, and I'm come over here. So whenever skill point is changed, I want to dispatch a new event. So there's two parameters. First is the name of the event. So I come over here, I kind of assume that I'm gonna listen to this event called skill point change. Right, so I copy this and I'm gonna paste this in. So this is the name of the event. And then the next thing is I'm gonna pass the data, whatever I'm gonna call with the event. So okay, so I don't need this on skill point change anymore. I'm gonna remove this. So let's take a look over here. Over here, when I change something, okay, you can't see it because this is no longer the new skill point. So if you inspect this, you could see that this is actually the event, right? And okay, I think as always, I told you don't take my word for it. So you should always inspect element and take a look. So go console, I clear everything, and I'm gonna click over here. You see that this is a custom event, and event has this property called detail, and detail is the data that we pass along with this event. So I'm gonna close this and I'm gonna say events.detail, which is the data that I pass in from here. So this is the event detail. I can pass in anything. I can pass in a string, a number, an object, an array, and anything that you can think of. So events.detail over here, and now if I decrement, you can see that it still works. You can have on skill point change and print out the skill point, right? The current skill point. So this is a way that you can dispatch an event from a component by creating event dispatcher and then dispatch the event. And as you can see, how we work through then and decides that, okay, we need to use an event dispatcher is realize that this way, when we do it this way, it kind of decouples from the user perspective, the user of this component versus the internal of the components, right? Right now it decouples where you don't assume that this event is always being listened by the user. It's not always being passed in. You don't have to always pass in a function. We can always dispatch an event and anyone can listen or not. It's optional, right? So you see that we can click on both components skill points. We can change both skill points, but it does not throw an error if I'm not listening to it. It's optional. So at some sense it's being decoupled already. Whether you're listening or you are dispatching, it's decoupled. So that's why so to use this event listener, you add event listener as the same way as adding event listeners to your elements. You add on skill point change. You pass in a function just like how you would, and you can pass in data for your event. So this will be the data. If you don't pass anything, it will be undefined. Don't take my word for it. It should be undefined in the event.detail. And let's see. Oh, wait. What? Okay. So right now, if you look at this statement, dispatch, what are the dependents, right? The dispatch, all the skill points. This is a string. So if this change so right now, if I change skill point, it will not re-evaluate this statement. So one workaround is I can call this skill point and then comma, so that this whole statement will be evaluated when skill point or dispatch has changed. So if I come over here and then you can see that right now it's okay. That's why I told you not to take my word for it. It's null instead of undefined. If you don't pass anything, it's null. Alright, so your event.detail will be null. And if I change it back, now you will see that it's the value again. So that's how you create events for your components. So if you have any questions, comments down below. And if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. And as always, subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when the next one is out. So see ya. Bye bye.